Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Last time we started looking at the Civil War. We looked at the various advantages, disadvantages for each side. We looked at the difficulty the U.S. had in achieving victories, at least early on, against Confederate forces. Um, and we looked at the issue, particularly of slavery, and how it evolved, how the United States approached the issue of slavery evolved over the course of the Civil War, from not being a particular war aim. Abolishing slavery anyway was not a particular war aim, and Lincoln was not focused on it, in part because he had to worry about the loyalty of the border states that had slaves. Yet by 1862 into 1863, he had decided that abolition of slavery had to become a war aim, and he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863, January of 1863. We also looked, of course, at the turning point of the war at Gettysburg, and the victory at Vicksburg in Mississippi in July of 1863. This was a turning point in the war, as we emphasized, but it did not mean the victory was near at hand, as we'll see, though it seemed to indicate that eventually, if the United States would stick with the war, that they were on course for eventual victory. Okay? We're going to look at here at first, and this should be a bit of a shorter lecture than the last one, to finish up on the Civil War, is we want to look at some of the problems at home. When I say home, I mean both for the United States and in the North, and the Confederate States of America in the South, right? The United States was not unified behind this war. There were, especially Democrats, there was opposition to the war, a desire for the war to end, and a negotiated peace that would allow the South to come back into the Union on very generous terms for the South. Okay, this was mainly again within the Democratic Party in the North, which was very much a minority party at this point, because all the Southern Democrats that had dominated the party had seceded with their states. But there are Democrats, some so-called peace Democrats, that Republicans often called copperheads. Copperhead is a kind of venomous snake, so it's obviously not a compliment, that term. Republicans would labeled anti-war opposition as unpatriotic, but you did have consistent Democrats who were consistently opposed to the war and wanted to end it as quickly as possible. And Lincoln had to worry about these Democrats, these so-called copperheads, undermining the war effort, something he was regularly worried about. And the Democrats, some of these copperhead Democrats would come forward with peace proposals, right? Frequently, that were on, again, easy terms for the South. And Lincoln labeled the so-called copperheads, the fire in the rear, something he had to worry about behind his back. Right? As he was looking south, trying to defeat the Confederate States, he had to worry about what he would see as disloyalty or dissension in Northern public opinion. Okay? And this was not only among leading Democrats in some leading Democrats in United States politics. It was also with just regular citizens of the United States. And this included particularly those who were being called up as the war kept going on. Initially, both sides got a lot of their support, a lot of their soldiers from volunteering. Volunteers came up in the early years of the war, when everyone's really almost eager to go to fight and filled with enthusiasm for their side. But as the war goes on and as it becomes increasingly bloody, it's harder to replenish those troops with volunteers. So both the North and the South begin implementing conscription laws. Okay, so drafting citizens into armies. Okay, which could lead to social dissension. In the North, in particular, the wealthy could purchase substitutes. This could happen in the South as well, in which a wealthy person could say, "Hey, I'll pay some amount of money, and someone else will take my place." Okay, and that created a lot of dissension, a lot of upset among those who were being called up and could be used as substitutes to replace a wealthy person, keep them from being drafted. Okay, and this led to I should have that broken up into 2 bullets, sorry. Most infamously, the New York City draft riots in July of 1863. So right as the time when the tide of the war is turning, with Gettysburg and Vicksburg, a group of mostly Irish immigrants swept through the city of New York protesting conscription laws. Okay, they attacked draft offices. They attacked the property of the wealthy, particularly those who were seen as profiting from the war, and they used the opportunity to attack black neighborhoods as well in the city. Okay. So in these draft riots, they the protesters burned millions of dollars in property and killed more than 100 people. It just gives you a sense that there is not the purpose of this slide. Really, what I'm talking about is that there's not complete unity of purpose in either the North or in the South, because it happens in the South as well. Dissension there tends to be more muted, particularly early on. They see themselves on the defensive, the South, and really come down hard on dissent. Some states could punish unionism or so-called support for either lack of support for secession or support for going back into the Union with death. It was punishable by death in some states. But by 1864, as the war was going on and as the South was paying such a big price in both its economy and in dead Southerners, Southern peace societies did begin to emerge. Okay, but that again created some dissension, some instability within Southern society, as there were those who wanted to keep going with the war and were outraged by this kind of peace sentiment in the South. Okay, so not fully unified societies by any stretch in either the North or the South in the Civil War. Again, as the war goes on, right? Remember we talked last time we were looking at the advantages and disadvantages. One of the things that the South, in their defensive strategy, they had a defensive strategy, but they wanted to inflict early defeats on the Union, on the United States, because they thought that they could then break the will of the United States to carry on the war. But the idea was that this if this was going to happen, it really needed to happen early, because if the war kept going on, the great advantages that the North has in its industry and its financing and its population, ability to replenish supplies, money, and soldiers, that would come to bear, right? And the South would be, over time, would be outproduced, outsoldiered, and outfinanced. Okay, because the North has all these economic advantages, population advantages, industrial capacity, and so forth. So as the war keeps going on, the North is better able to withstand the rigors and the difficulties that they face, as long as they maintain their will to keep fighting. Okay, right? They're able to fund the war through taxes, printing of paper currency, loans. They're better able to raise money, in essence. And the production of all goods actually increases in the North during the war, because they have a productive capacity that they can rely on to produce all kinds of goods, whether for domestic consumption or for military use. Okay? In the South, it's very different. Their economy suffers. They do not have this industrial base. They do not have the same kind of population. They're suffering the effects of the blockade of the United States, blockading, not completely effectively, but hurting Southern exports of cotton, right? So that's what their economy relies on. And of course, the United States is not any longer buying Southern cotton because of the war. So the Southern economy suffers markedly. Production of goods falls by 1/3. So whereas it's increasing, production of all goods is increasing during the war in the United States. In the Confederate States, the productions of goods falls by 1/3 during this war as the war goes on. Okay. And the Confederate Congress tended to resist high taxes, right? Remember that the Confederate Southern sentiment, let's say, go even before the Civil War. Remember when we talked about things like the Nullification Acts and their approach to slavery, right? The South really wanted a weak national government, right? So it's very much about states' rights, and this carries over into this new Confederacy, right? So it's difficult for the Confederacy with its states' rights approach. The Confederate Congress as a national institution for the Confederate States doesn't have the same power that the United States Congress, the United States government has. Okay, they take all that states' rights thinking with them into the South, but it hurts them when they're trying to mobilize for this great war. And so the Confederate Congress tended to resist higher taxes to pay for the war. So they tended to rely on Confederate States of America tended to rely on printing paper money, but without a lot of backing, a backing of hard currency behind it. So they printed a lot recklessly, and you ended up having very high inflation, actually going into hyperinflation during the war. Okay, so a lot of printing of paper money to buy fewer and fewer goods, because they're also you're printing a lot of paper money, but you also have fewer production of goods. So you have a lot of money chasing too few goods, which is the classic recipe for an inflation problem, right? Just to give you one measure, there are many measures you could look at. In 1860, the typical Southerner spent about $6.55 per month to feed a family. But by 1864, it's $68.25. So you can see an enormous increase in the cost of living for your typical Southerner. Okay, so over time, the Northern advantages are coming to bear more and more as the war goes on. Okay, into 1864. Okay, so we'll go back to the war here, back to the front or the fronts. Final victory is elusive, however, right? Even though the tide of the war seemed to have turned in 1863. Okay, the war keeps going on. The South does not surrender. The South keeps resisting. By 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, who has made his name as a major fighting force in the West, is appointed by Lincoln to lead the Army of the Potomac, right? So to bring his skills to the fighting in the East. And he begins a war of attrition against the Army of Northern Virginia. And attrition here just simply means throwing resources, whether they be weapons or soldiers, continuously at the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay? And you're not going to try to have some kind of genius move or some major subtle strategic act of genius. You're just going to throw all kinds of power and resources against the Army of Northern Virginia. And you're going to let the the U.S.'s advantages play out, okay? And this ends up working, but it does cost a lot, particularly in lives. Grant is not shy about throwing soldiers who are clearly going to die into battles in large numbers in order to overwhelm the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay, and again, as I've said before, right, the North can replenish its manpower much more easily than can the Confederate States. And so if you keep throwing men against the South, eventually you're going to, the idea is that theoretically, if you keep doing it, the South is eventually going to just run out of soldiers. Okay? Grant began attacking the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee continuously in 1864. Slow but steady progress moving towards Richmond. Okay, and these were campaigns of great carnage, great violence, and death in a lot of these campaigns in 1864. And you can see in this map, many of them, he's moving down from Northern Virginia, Grant is, and some of these battles are famous, particularly for their carnage. The Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, Chancellorsville. A lot of these are very famous battles, known in particular for the high casualty counts. And as you can see, he's moving down here slowly, battle after battle, moving, trying to get around Lee, and Lee's moving down here to counter and defend the South, and particularly defend Richmond. This is throughout 1864. Okay, many of these battles mainly the spring and summer of 1864. Okay. At the same time, around the same time, General William Tecumseh Sherman of the United States Army, he's the other leading general, the leading heroic general of the United States cause in this war. He begins leading U.S. forces into Georgia, okay, to try to begin capturing Southern territory in the South. Okay, so even though the United States is on the march here, but again, it's slow. In Lincoln, if we're looking at, we're talking about the spring and summer of 1864. What's coming up in this fall of 1864? Well, that's the presidential election. And Lincoln fears that he may lose, right? That the United States, the North, is war weary. They want it to end, and they could have an appeal by a Democrat. Possibly they'll come along and say, I can end this war. I'll end this war right away. I'll come to some terms. And Lincoln fears that enough Americans will vote for that alternative. He will lose the election, and then we'll end up having the United States will end up having the South come back into the Union, but on very easy terms for the South. Okay, which Lincoln opposes, right? And he actually ends up running against our old friend George B. McClellan, who we talked about last time. He was he built up the Army of the Potomac, but remember, he was really good at building up armies and training them, but not particularly good at employing them in actual battles. And Lincoln had fired him. Well, he comes back. He's a Democrat, and he comes back and challenges Lincoln for the presidency. He's nominated by the Democratic Party, and he challenges Lincoln for the presidency. And Lincoln was so worried, just as an aside here, that's how Nevada comes into the Union as it does in 1864, even though there were not that many people living in Nevada at the time, so it didn't really lend itself to becoming a state because it didn't fit the criteria of having enough people there. But Lincoln really wants the extra electoral votes, so basically the Republicans engage in a little chicanery and work Nevada into early statehood. They know it's a strongly Republican state, and I think the Nevada state motto is "Battle Born," means that it came into the Union during the Civil War, right before the election of 1864, because Lincoln wanted to get a few more electoral votes to ensure his victory, and so that he could carry on the Civil War to its end. Just an aside there, something that gives Lincoln's election a boost is in September of 1864, so a couple months before the election, William Tecumseh Sherman takes Atlanta, right? He captures one of the largest southern states, and again, this is in the deep South in Georgia, and this has a huge psychological impact in both the North and the South. In the North, it's a boon to their effort, improves morale, and it does very much the opposite in the South, as now you have the Union forces, U.S. forces, occupying one of the major cities in the Deep South, okay? If Lincoln was worried, he probably didn't have that much to worry about. He does win an easy victory. Of course, all the dark gray are seceded southern states. And again, Lincoln wins a handy victory, winning almost all states except border states of Kentucky, Delaware, and I don't know if you consider New Jersey a border state at this time, but New Jersey does go Democratic. But it's a clear victory for Lincoln, and indeed, it appears that most of the soldiers in the field who were doing the fighting voted for Lincoln, even though if they perhaps voted for McClellan, they may have gotten home earlier. They showed they were sufficiently committed to the cause and impressed with Lincoln's leadership that U.S. Army, U.S. soldiers, when they were given the opportunity to vote, voted for Lincoln in large numbers. Okay? All right, so let's look at the end here, end game of this war. Some of the things that happened in the last year or so of the war. In January of 1865, Congress adopted the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution bans slavery. So essentially abolishes slavery in the United States. Okay, so this essentially puts the Emancipation Proclamation into the Constitution. And this is, if you've ever seen the movie, Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln, that movie is really about Lincoln's efforts to get the 13th Amendment passed in Congress. And then it goes out to the states for ratification. You need 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment, and then it can become part of the Constitution. This happens in December 1865. Lincoln does not live to see this. He lives to see it passed by Congress, but not ratified, though it does become part of the Constitution in 1865. So one of the war aims the United States adds after the war starts to abolish slavery is now completed. So we're going to go back a little bit here. Back in late 1864, so after Lincoln, not long before the passage of the 13th Amendment in Congress, Sherman begins his famous, or if you have a Southern perspective, his infamous March to the Sea. And you can see up here, he takes Atlanta, and then he decides he's going to go down with his troops, cutting a swath of destruction throughout the South, destroying food and supplies, any soldiers that it meets, any regiments, Southern regiments that it meets, it will engage. But it moves down, destroying infrastructure and food and supplies in the South, right, a 60-mile swath through the heart of Georgia all the way to the sea, so down to Savannah, and then he will move up into South Carolina towards Charleston and then Columbia. Okay, so he basically was trying to crush Southern morale And as he said in his own words, to whip the rebels, to humble their pride. There should be a comma here, I think. Let me add that right now. To follow them to their innermost recesses and make them fear and dread us. So he's trying to just crush Southern morale and cause them to surrender by being particularly brutal. Okay, and for Southerners, they do not remember this particularly well. Some Southerners, anyway. And see it as sort of the modern day equivalent of war crimes. But this is one of those areas where you see the distinction between civilians and military forces being blurred. Right? He's destroying whatever kind of food and supplies or infrastructure he sees, just to make the ability of the South to carry on with the war that much more difficult. Okay. So jumping ahead a little bit here. Right, so he begins his march to the sea, and then he's moving up into Sherman's moving up into South Carolina in early 1865, and Grant, around the same time in the spring, he breaks Lee's lines at Petersburg, which leaves Richmond defenseless. And Lincoln, in what must have been a very satisfying visit, travels down to Richmond to survey the occupied capital of the Southern Confederate States of America. Okay. And you can see here, he's moving down here, and by this time in the spring of 1865, Grant has taken Petersburg, which and Lee's forces have to push out to the west here, and essentially leaves Richmond defenseless. The U.S. forces can come around and occupy Richmond. And from here, the war is nearly over. Grant continues to dog Lee out here to a little further out into Virginia near the Appomattox Courthouse, and this is where Grant surrenders, okay, at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865, okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, Lincoln does not live to see not only the 13th Amendment ratified by the states, he barely lives to see the end of the war. 2 days after the surrender, on April 11th, in what was to be his last public speech, Lincoln called for the first time in public for black suffrage, okay, for voting rights for black men, freed slaves. And 3 days after that, on April 14th, he was, I should go back for a second. In the audience listening to this speech was John Wilkes Booth. He was a partisan of the South, a famous actor, but he was supportive of the South's cause, and mumbled under his breath, well, that's the last speech that Lincoln's ever going to give. And 3 days later, after the speech on April 11th, while Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, Booth snuck into the theater, into Lincoln's box, and shot Lincoln, who in the head. Lincoln was carried across the street and died later the next day, in the early mornings of the next day. Okay. We're going to stop there at the end of the war, but we're moving into a particularly important period. I think technically this course is really supposed to go to 1865. Okay, so we really should be ending now. However, we are going to talk about, for the next final two lectures, Reconstruction. It's the final chapter of the textbook. It is a particularly important and understudied period as the United States tries to reincorporate the Southern states back into the Union and try to remake Southern life. Remember, we talked way back early on about the difference between a Southern slave state and a slave society, I should say, and a society with slaves. And I mentioned that societies with slaves were easier to make the transition from slave labor to free labor because there weren't really nearly as many slaves in a society with slaves. So you can free the slaves, and it doesn't change much. But in slave societies, slavery is so ingrained, intertwined with the economy and the culture of the society, of the slave society, that getting rid of slavery changes everything. Okay, and it's hard to envision how that slave society is going to transition into a free society. And that's going to be one of the main challenges during Reconstruction. And there are some successes, but also a lot of failure as the United States tries to do this. And so whenever I teach History 120 or 121, I teach Reconstruction either at the end or the beginning so that everyone, whether you take 120 or 121, you get some exposure to Reconstruction because it's a really important period in American history. So that's what we're going to look at, the final two lectures, and I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.